In northeastern Wyoming, a monolithic column of stone rises more than 860 feet from rolling grassland into a sky so wide it swallows everything. At sunrise, the vertical grooves turn gold. At sunset, the rock burns a deep, impossible red, as if the heat that formed it 50 million years ago still lingers inside. No photograph has ever captured its true scale, because the human eye cannot reconcile something this massive with something this vertical. It should not exist, and yet it does. Geologists have argued for over a century about what it actually is. Native nations have known its name far longer, and the most recent investigations have uncovered something nobody was prepared for. If you are new here, this channel covers the ancient history buried beneath American soil that most people were never taught. Subscribe and drop a comment if you had ever heard of the real story behind Devil's Tower. What most visitors see when they arrive at Devil's Tower National Monument is a geological impossibility wrapped in a parking lot. They step out of their cars, look up, and fall silent. The formation rises 1,267 feet above the Belle Fourche River, its summit reaching 5,112 feet above sea level. The top is roughly the size of a football field, about 1.5 acres of flat stone and wild grass suspended in the sky. The base stretches nearly a mile in circumference, and every inch of its surface is scored with long, vertical columns that look, from a distance, like the pleats of an unimaginably large curtain drawn across the plains. These are not cracks. They are not erosion patterns. They are columns of phonolite porphyry, a rare igneous rock composed of anorthoclase feldspar, aegirine augite pyroxene, and sphene, locked together in a crystalline matrix that formed under pressures and temperatures the surface world never sees. Each column measures between 6 and 8 feet in diameter at the base, tapering to roughly 4 feet near the summit, and some of them run unbroken for nearly 600 feet. They may be the longest columnar joints ever recorded in volcanic rock on Earth. The question that has haunted geologists since 1888 is deceptively simple. How did this thing get here? The first scientific study was conducted by a geologist named Carpenter in that year, and his conclusion was straightforward. Devil's Tower, he proposed, was a volcanic conduit, the solidified throat of an ancient volcano whose outer cone had long since eroded away, leaving only this stubborn plug of cooled magma standing like a chimney above a house that no longer exists. It was an elegant idea. It was also, according to later researchers, almost certainly incomplete. 2 years later, in 1894, a Yale-trained petrologist named Louis V. Pearson examined the rock and came to a very different conclusion. What he saw was not the remnant of a volcanic pipe, but something called a laccolith, a lens-shaped body of magma that had intruded between layers of sedimentary rock, doming the strata above it like a blister before cooling and hardening underground. Thomas A. Jagger, who would later become famous for his work on Hawaiian volcanoes, supported this interpretation in 1901. So did Nelson Horatio Darton of the United States Geological Survey and C.C. O'Hara of the South Dakota School of Mines, who published supporting work in 1907. The laccolith theory held for decades. It appeared in textbooks. It was taught in classrooms. It became, for many, the settled answer. But science does not settle, it argues. In 1896, Israel C. Russell proposed that the tower was neither a volcanic plug nor a laccolith, but a magmatic stock, a small body of intrusive igneous rock that had pushed upward through the surrounding sediment without ever reaching the surface. Charles S. Robinson of the United States Geological Survey expanded on this idea in 1956 with Bulletin 1021I, which remains one of the most detailed geological surveys of the tower ever published. Robinson examined the structure, the mineral composition, and the surrounding terrain, and concluded that what visitors were looking at was a body of intrusive rock that defied easy classification. Not a plug, not a laccolith, something in between. Then, in 2015, a team led by Prokop Zavada of the Institute of Geophysics at the Czech Academy of Sciences published a paper in Geosphere, the Journal of the Geological Society of America, that upended the conversation entirely. Zavada and his colleagues, including Petr Dedicek, proposed that Devil's Tower was not the remnant of a slow intrusion at all, but the solidified core of a Mar Diatreme volcano. According to their model, ascending magma encountered groundwater roughly 50 million years ago, triggering violent steam-driven explosions that blasted a broad volcanic crater into the landscape. A lake of lava pooled inside that crater and cooled slowly, forming the massive columnar joints visible today. The tower, in this reading, is not something that pushed up from below. It is something that pooled, cooled, and was then revealed by millions of years of erosion, stripping away everything around it. What researchers actually found when they dated the rock added another layer of complexity. In 1961, W.A. Bassett published a study in Science using potassium-argon dating that placed the tower's formation at approximately 40.5 million years ago. That number stood for 4 decades. Then, in 2002, Duke and his colleagues applied argon-argon dating to sanidine crystals extracted from the phonolite and arrived at a significantly older figure, 49.04 million years, plus or minus 160,000 years. The tower was not 40 million years old, it was closer to 50. Nearly 10 million years of geological history had been miscounted. And yet none of this explains the columns themselves. In 2018, a team led by Anthony Lamour and Jan Lavallee at the University of Liverpool published a study in Nature Communications that finally quantified the temperature at which columnar joints form. The answer was between 840 and 890 degrees Celsius. That is the threshold at which cooling rock undergoes macroscopic fracture, splitting into the polygonal columns that make Devil's Tower so visually arresting. The size of the columns depends on the rate of cooling. Slower cooling produces larger columns. The extraordinary size of the columns at Devil's Tower suggests that the magma cooled very slowly indeed, insulated by the sedimentary rock that once surrounded it on all sides. What the evidence suggests is that the tower visitors see today is only the skeleton of something much larger. The flesh has been stripped away by time, by water, by wind, by the patient geology of erosion working across tens of millions of years. But long before any geologist arrived with a hammer and a hypothesis, the tower already had a name, many names in fact. Subscribe now because what scientists found on the summit is something nobody saw coming. The Lakota people call it Mato Tipala, Bear Lodge. The Cheyenne call it Bear's Lodge. The Crow Nation knows it as Daxpiche-Asau, home of bears. The Arapaho call it Bear's Tipi. The Kiowa call it Soai, which translates to tree rock. More than 20 tribal nations hold this formation as a site of deep spiritual significance. Every single indigenous name refers to bears or to shelter. Not one references evil, devils, or malevolent spirits. Not one. The most widely known origin story comes from the Kiowa, recorded in 1897 from an elder known as I See Many Campfire Places at Fort Sill, Oklahoma. 7 young sisters were playing in the open grassland when they were pursued by a giant bear. Desperate and terrified, they climbed onto a low rock and prayed for the stone itself to save them. The rock heard their prayer and began to rise, lifting the girls higher and higher into the sky, while the bear clawed furiously at its sides, leaving the deep vertical grooves that score the tower's surface to this day. The girls rose so high they became stars, transformed into the Pleiades constellation, where they remain visible on clear nights. The Pulitzer Prize-winning Kiowa author N. Scott Momaday retold this story in his 1969 masterpiece, The Way to Rainy Mountain. As a child, a Kiowa elder gave him the name Tuai Tali, Rock Tree Boy, binding his identity to the tower itself. The Cheyenne hold the site sacred for a different and arguably even more profound reason. Their cultural hero, Sweet Medicine, who brought the 4 sacred arrows to the Cheyenne people, is said to have died at Bear Lodge. According to Cheyenne oral tradition, the 4 sacred arrows are located inside a secret cave within the tower. This is not folklore in the casual sense. This is foundational spiritual architecture, equivalent in weight to any sacred text in any tradition on earth. The Lakota connection runs equally deep. A story recorded from Short Bull of the Oglala on July 31, 1932, describes a warrior who fasted at the rock's base and was mysteriously transported to the summit, where he found the footprints of a very large bear scored into the stone. Notable Lakota leaders, including Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, reportedly visited the tower for spiritual purposes. Sun dance ceremonies have been held at the site since 1983, typically near the summer solstice, alongside sweat lodge ceremonies, vision quests, sacred pipe ceremonies, healing rituals, and funeral rites. Prayer offerings, cloths and bundles tied to trees along the trails are visible to any visitor who walks the paths below the tower. So how did Bear Lodge become Devil's Tower? The answer involves a mistranslation, a military expedition, and a bureaucratic error that has persisted for more than a century and a half. In 1875, Lieutenant Colonel Richard Irving Dodge led the military escort for a scientific survey of the Black Hills, organized by the Office of Indian Affairs. The expedition's geologist was Henry Newton. Prior to Dodge's arrival, every map of the region, including Lieutenant G.K. Warren's 1857 survey, and even the records from Custer's 1874 expedition, labeled the formation as Bear Lodge or Mado Teepee. But Dodge's interpreter, a man known as Romeo, described as part Cheyenne and part Mexican, rendered one of the indigenous names as Bad God's Tower. From there, the name drifted to Devil's Tower and stuck. No indigenous oral tradition, no tribal record, no elder's account has ever associated the site with evil spirits or devils. The name is, by every credible historical analysis, a mistake. The effort to correct that mistake has been long, frustrating, and politically charged. In 2014, Chief Arvil Lookinghorse, the spiritual leader of the Lakota, Dakota, and Nakota Oyate, submitted a formal proposal to the United States Board on Geographic Names, requesting the restoration of Bear Lodge. The National Congress of American Indians passed a resolution calling the current name offensive, insulting, and disparaging. But a succession of Wyoming congressional representatives, including Barbara Cuban, Cynthia Lummis, and Liz Cheney, introduced blocking bills designed to prevent the board from acting. The strategy has been effective not because the bills passed, but because their introduction alone was sufficient to freeze the bureaucratic process. As recently as January 2025, Senators Lummis and Barrasso reintroduced their blocking legislation. The name endures. The controversy endures with it. What the record actually shows is that on September 24, 1906, President Theodore Roosevelt signed the proclamation that made Devil's Tower the first national monument in the United States. The very first application of the Antiquities Act, which had been signed into law on June 8th of that same year, championed by Representative John F. Lacey of Iowa. Roosevelt described the formation as such an extraordinary example of the effect of erosion in the higher mountains as to be a natural wonder and an object of historic and great scientific interest. The proclamation designated approximately 1,152 acres of protected land. It was a landmark moment in American conservation, and yet it sealed into federal law a name that dishonors the very nations whose ancestors first named the place. The human story of the tower is as vertical as the rock itself. On July 4, 1893, two local ranchers named William Rogers and Willard Ripley became the first people in recorded history to reach the summit. Their method was audacious, impractical, and magnificent. Over 6 weeks, they built a 350-foot wooden ladder on the southeast face, hammering oak pegs roughly 3 inches in diameter and 24 to 30 inches long into a natural crack between two columns. Rogers climbed wearing an Uncle Sam costume and carried an American flag. An estimated 800 spectators gathered below to watch. The ladder's remnants were partially restored by the National Park Service in 1972 and can still be seen with binoculars from the base. The first technical rock climb came on June 28, 1937, when Fritz Wiesner, one of the finest climbers of his generation, ascended the southeast face with Lawrence Coveney and William P. House, all members of the American Alpine Club. They reached the summit in 4 hours and 48 minutes using 35 meters of Italian hemp rope, canvas climbing shoes, a handful of carabiners, and only one piton, which Wiesner later said was unnecessary. It was, by any measure, a pure free climb on one of the most intimidating rock faces in North America. Then came the stunt that made the tower famous for all the wrong reasons. On October 1, 1941, a professional parachutist named George Hopkins accepted a $50 bet to parachute onto the summit. He landed successfully, but the rope and climbing supplies that were dropped after him bounced off the edge and tumbled into the void. Hopkins was stranded for 6 days. Approximately 7,000 visitors came to watch the spectacle. Jack Durrance, who had established his own climbing route on the tower in 1938, traveled from Dartmouth College to lead the rescue, guiding a team of 8 climbers to bring Hopkins safely down on October 6th. Today, thousands of climbers attempt the tower each year. And this is where the story turns contentious again. In 1995, under Superintendent Deborah Liggett, the National Park Service implemented a voluntary climbing closure for the month of June to respect the sacred ceremonies held by Native nations during that period. The comparison drawn by Park Ranger Tyler Devine was stark. Climbing during the ceremonies, he said, was like climbing the Great Mosque during Hajj or climbing St. Peter's on Easter. Before the voluntary closure, more than 1,200 people climbed in June alone. In its first year, 1996, only 167 climbers ascended during the closure month, an 86% reduction. The closure was immediately challenged in court. A commercial climbing guide named Andy Petfish, backed by the Mountain States Legal Foundation, filed suit in Bear Lodge Multiple Use Association versus Babbitt, arguing that the voluntary closure constituted an unconstitutional government endorsement of religion. On April 2, 1998, United States District Judge William Downs dismissed the case, applying the Lemon versus Kurtzman test. The 10th Circuit Court of Appeals affirmed in April 1999. The Supreme Court declined to hear the case in March of 2000. The voluntary closure stood. But compliance has eroded over the decades. By 2016, 373 climbers were ascending in June, reducing the effective compliance rate to roughly 75%. What scientists found on the summit itself adds yet another dimension to the story. A 2016 vegetation assessment conducted by Hollis Marriott and Cheryl Mayer of the Wyoming Natural Diversity Database documented 53 plant species growing on top of the tower, an isolated island of prairie ecosystem suspended nearly 900 feet above the surrounding landscape. 2 distinct plant communities thrive there, a skunkbush sumac and bluebunch wheatgrass community on the rocky southern and western exposures, and a Wyoming big sagebrush and mixed grasses community on the northeastern side, where soils are better developed. The sagebrush on the summit grows more abundantly than anywhere else in the entire monument. Prickly pear cactus, harebells, sand lilies, and 4 o'clocks bloom in season. Chipmunks, mice, and pack rats live permanently on the summit. Snakes have been found there. Prairie falcons and peregrine falcons nest on the tower's vertical faces. It is not a dead rock. It is a living world, cut off from the ground below, evolving in its own quiet direction. Below the tower, the discoveries have been equally remarkable. In 2021, National Park Service Chief Archaeologist Russ Cash identified vegetation anomalies in the northern meadows of the monument. Ground-penetrating radar surveys along Joyner Ridge revealed more than 200 features of interest, vastly exceeding the initial estimate of approximately 36 sites. These features are believed to be the remnants of sweat lodges, teepees, and hearths, described as the largest prehistoric occupations ever found within the park boundaries. Evidence suggests that people have hunted mammoth and bison with short-range weapons in this area for at least 11,500 years. No artifacts were collected during the survey, out of respect for indigenous sacred traditions. A separate 2019 paleontological inventory by Justin Tweet documented Jurassic-era marine invertebrate fossils, bivalves, ammonites, sea urchins, and oysters dating to between 163 and 170 million years ago, embedded in the sedimentary formations surrounding the tower. The ground beneath visitors' feet contains the compressed remains of an ancient sea. What remains, then, is a place that resists simple explanation. The geologists cannot agree on how it formed. The politicians cannot agree on what to call it. The climbers and the ceremony keepers cannot agree on who has the right to ascend it. The rock itself offers no answers. It simply stands, as it has stood for nearly 50 million years. While the river curves below it, the hawks circle above it, and the columns catch the last light of the day and hold it for a moment before letting it go. Science has measured the temperature at which those columns cracked into being. It has dated the crystals inside the phonolite to within 160,000 years. It has mapped the plants on the summit, cataloged the fossils at the base, and scanned the meadows with radar to find the traces of people who lived and prayed there millennia before anyone thought to call it a monument. But there is something about standing at the base of Mato Tipola, looking up at those impossible columns vanishing into the sky, that no instrument has yet been built to measure. The Kiowa say 7 sisters became stars to escape the bear. The Lakota say a warrior found giant footprints on the summit. The Cheyenne say their most sacred objects rest inside. Science says it is phonolite porphyry, 49 million years old, cooling at 860 degrees. Both are true. Neither is complete. If this changed how you see Devil's Tower, leave it in the comments and subscribe for more ancient American history hiding in plain sight.